Let go.
All right, I'm delighted to introduce Ron. Back in 1977, when Ron Bowen founded Prairie Restorations, restoring land using regionally native vegetation was rare, especially in urban and suburban landscapes. Not only were native plants and seeds hard to come by, so was finding staff who were well acquainted with the individual personalities of native plants as well as native plant communities. Over 40 years later, Ron has built the longest operating full-service ecological restoration company in the United States. Throughout the decades, he has helped restore thousands of acres of prairies, woodlands, shorelands, wetlands, home landscapes, and solar sites, always with an eye to providing habitat for wildlife. Join us for a photographic journey of Ron's projects over the years, hear his stories, learn about his experiences striving to create habitat that welcomes a diversity of insect life as well as other wildlife. Take her away, Ron.
Thank you, Jessica. That's very nice. And I'm sure that I have met probably many of you, and so hello. It's sort of unusual to communicate this way. I'd much rather be in a room with all of you, but that's how it is these days. So with that introduction that Jessica gave, that's basically a long, kind of drawn out 50 years. But you know, my very first restoration was actually in 1970, and so 50 years ago, as a gardener working for the Dayton family, I kind of set out to plant a prairie. And in those days, the availability of seed and plant material was very limited. And so that created a huge challenge. A big hurdle for me was, how do I utilize native plants if they're not really available? And some were, but not many. And furthermore, I got this crazy notion that they shouldn't just be native plants, but they should be local origin native plants. So that adds a whole nother layer of complexity. So anyway, long and short of it is, I struck off to find plants and seeds in remnants that were left. And as a side note to that, it's really disappointing and discouraging in some ways to realize how many of those early sources of materials are now long gone. You know, the remnant pieces that were here in 1970 or 1980 just continue to diminish. There's fewer and fewer of those really true remnants that are left. So that's become even more challenging today. Anyway, I struck off and started to grow plants. I would collect small amounts of seed, and I had a little greenhouse, and I would grow plants. And eventually that morphed into prairie restorations. So, of course, the company, as Jessica said, was one of the early companies. And today, very, I think, gratifying to note that there are really many companies, and most of you know that. We're not all the same. In fact, none of us are exactly the same. But we function in a world where native plants are very much high priority. In some cases, the high priority. And that's the case at Prairie Restorations. So utilizing native plants in the so-called built landscape has become very challenging, gratifying work, I think, for you, all of you who are working with native plants, and even in the smallest rain garden or little perennial garden, or in the 1,000 acres. So this map that you see in front of you, of course, is known as the Marshner map. And it was put together in 1930 by a guy named Marshner, and really depicts the basic 28 different cover types that were found in our state roughly around 1850 to 1900. And so again, this is not necessarily always the goal, but it's an indicator of what was here at that time, realizing that if we had a map from 1500, it would be different. And just as the map today is greatly different in that the prairie is virtually gone. Much of the woodland and wetland plant communities have been drastically altered. So again, we use this as an important reference. You can find it online. It's a very important thing to look at. And if you ever really want to get into it more, look at the original land survey notes from when the land survey was done. And if you know your township and range, you can actually pinpoint a specific area. So what we did is from those remaining remnants in 1970 and 1975, we collected initial seed. And again, with the priority that we would have local origin materials. Local origin to us has typically been meaning within a 200-mile radius. So genetic origin of seed and plants within 200 miles. Now that's a big generalization, but that's kind of what we've used. So again, you see here on the left of your screen a bag of butterfly milkweed seed. On the right, some grasses that we have produced. I'm trying to read the little, I think that's actually a sedge. And again, we grow plants in various container sizes. We have fields now of seed production. So this is one of our fields here in Princeton. We have about 400 acres in Princeton where we raise seed and plants. We have another 500-acre property up near Moorhead. That collection of seed materials is what we call the Red River Valley origin. The one you're looking at here is the Anoka Sand Plain genotype. And so we really have two distinctly different genetic origins for our materials. And we do machine harvest if we can. It greatly reduces the price and increases the volume. So if we can use these old combines, we do. If we can't, we will collect with a lesser machine. This is a flail harvester, which is just basically a whirling bunch of nylon, pieces of nylon that beat the seed into the back hopper of this, and you empty it every so often. You get a lot of straw. It's far from perfect, but this is a item that you can buy. There's a guy named John Morgan up in Manitoba who produces these. And so again, you can find these, you pull them with a vehicle or a tractor, and you can get some seed that way. Combining, you get a much cleaner finished product. So, again, this is, there are many, many different ways that you can be innovative to gather seed. And I think in the future, there need to be many more. Our minds all need to work on new inventions and ways to harvest this seed. When you go to farm machinery, combines as an example, it's been very, very tailored to a consistent product. So our soybeans and our corn and wheat are all hybridized to the point where the seed is basically the same size. It ripens essentially at the same time. It's designed for mass production. Native seed, on the other hand, is not, and that would in fact defeat the purpose of having a lot of diversity in the species. So here's a field of little blue stem, and part of it has been combined, but some of that seed was combined too soon. Some of it had already fallen on the ground. We don't have native seed that all gets ripe on the 15th of September. It starts on September 1st, and some of it is still maybe not ripe on September 30th. So, you have to pick and make those compromises. So all of our seed, because again, we want diversity, has those traits that are not consistent. And again, that's what we want. Now, when we're growing flowers in a plot like either of these, Elaipis pycnostochea on the left and butterfly milkweed on the right, these are grown with the anticipation that they will be hand collected. And so as this progression of materials has come along since 1970, we have learned how to do more of this stuff, but a plant like just pycnostochea, a really nice, valuable plant, still has enough variety in it that we literally hand clip all of those seed stalks, gather them as seed stalks, and then process them further at a later date by chopping and refining it, cleaning, and getting it down to a finished product. On the other hand, butterfly milkweed, as an example, we used to hand shuck all of the pods. You literally would collect the milkweed pods, twist them open, and strip the seed out. And when you do that, you end up with pretty clean seed. It's pretty much ready to go. It doesn't need to be refined further. Nowadays, we're actually combining butterfly milkweed, and so it does need to be refined further after the fact. So it varies by species. It's highly variable. Some of these species, like Liatris, we still produce thousands of seedling plants as well as seed. And so on some projects, it's more appropriate to use plants. Other projects, you can go with seed. And the same can be said for butterfly milkweed. So again, there's been a lot of progress, and yet there's a huge progress to be made. We have a long ways to go on this process. And Prairie Vista, along with the other folks in the industry, perhaps some of you, continue to try and devise better ways to mass produce these materials. They, of course, are the basic building blocks of your gardens and restorations throughout the Midwest. Without the seed or the plants, there's very little opportunity to be successful in restoration. So again, whether it's a garden or something bigger. And so here again, various seeds. You can see the species here. And we raise a lot of different species, so they really kind of all have their own characteristics. Black-eyed Susan, very basic, readily available. The genetic origin of Black-eyed Susan it's so mixed up at this point in North America that it's pretty hard to know exactly where your origin is from. It's a very, very adaptable species, so you can grow Black-eyed Susan successfully from, let's just say, New Hampshire, Minnesota, probably Oregon, and it can all work here in Minnesota. Whereas some species are not that way. Some species, it's very important to have local origin in gene pools. And so here again, something like lupin is highly specific to certain soils and geographic areas. So when it gets to the application level, where you've already got the materials, now you're going to be planting the materials. It's really important to go back to that state map. Wisconsin has one as well. And look at what was there 150 years ago. That's a good indication of your future success. If it was a prairie, it sort of still wants to be a prairie. It's a lot easier to put a prairie back where a prairie was than, say, to put a spruce fir forest where a prairie was. And it's a lot easier to put a spruce fir forest where a spruce fir forest was and not a prairie. Now, there's some exceptions, and you can do almost anything. if you work at it and spend enough money. So anyway, again, learning about the plant ranges, I think even down to the level of residential projects, whether they're gardens or a back field or a front field, I think looking at what I call species matching is really, really important. So you need to look and determine what was there. Did lupin, for example, grow in Alexandria, Minnesota? The answer is no. And you can plant lupin there. We have a couple sites up there that where it did pretty well for a while. But you're way ahead if you look and plant it where it did grow pre-settlement. So it grows very abundantly here on our farm in Princeton. We don't even try and grow it up at our farm by Moorhead. I don't know how successful it would be. It's not worth the effort. So, but here in Princeton, where it was native, it does very well. That's a field on the right here. That's a field of lupin seed production. And we produce probably as much lupin as anybody in the world of Lupinus perennis. Now remember, some of you might not be aware that the so-called North Shore lupin is not native to Minnesota. It's native on the east, on the west coast. So places like Oregon and Washington. It has naturalized here, and most of us, I think, would consider it to be a weed. And for those of you who are disappointed to hear me say that, you should think about it, because in reality, it's replacing a lot of native plants because it's so competitive. And certainly it's attractive, it's beautiful, but when you think about what it's eliminating, it's not so pretty. And so in our book, we consider it to be a weed. But Lupinus perennis is native in the sand plain. It's native over into western Wisconsin. It's native all the way into upstate New York on the East Coast. So there's a big range. Go west of the metro, it's really not native and really probably won't persist for too long. This is part of the challenge. This little slide here is a good example of the challenge involved with seed production. Number one, this seed pod probably doesn't have more than 100 seeds in it. So it's not like it's highly productive. And number two, it's really a Dickens to collect. There's no machinery that we know of to be used in this. So it's hand picking these little pods, which grow about 6 inches off the ground, and then dealing with processing the seed. You can see it's beautiful seed. By the way, if you ever get a chance to look at particularly fresh seed under a microscope, you should do it. It's beautiful. Some of the seeds are absolutely gorgeous. Look at prairie drop seed sometime. It's beautiful. And prairie violet is very nice as well. So again, this is not bird's foot violet, but this is prairie violet, which was, prior to settlement, very, very abundant throughout Minnesota. Places were in the spring, and you can find historical records, accounts of the hillsides were blue, and it was from prairie violet. Now today, this plant in natural settings has gotten pretty scarce. We have a little bit that grows on our farm here in Princeton. I have a little bit on a small remnant at my house over by St. Cloud, but it's nowhere near what it is on a good remnant prairie or what it used to be. And part of that, I think anyway, is pollinator issues. So it's not recruiting a new generation like it used to. That's sort of a separate discussion and a very important discussion, the relationship between plants and pollinators and the loss of some of our plants because they're not recruiting the next generation, because the seed is not getting pollinated, and hence the amount of viable seed that's being produced is way less, in my opinion. Now that, that isn't every species, but so again, the production of seed is critical. That's been part of the journey, and it will continue to be going forward. There are many more species that need to be worked on and figured out how to make it work. Some of the seed, like pathrush on the left here, is tiny. This is the size of a pinhead, less. And so, in that pile of seed you see there, there's probably 5 million seeds. You don't need necessarily too much. But getting these seed production plots started can be as tedious as hand planting. So what we did historically is we took, we collected seed from remnant populations, wherever we could find them, oftentimes railroads, and grew that seed. Maybe it was thimbleful, maybe it was a cupful, but it was never a large amount. We grew that in greenhouses to get as many seedlings as possible. Then we took those seedlings, like you see in these two images, and we lined them out in a field. And so basically we're hand planting, and this is with an old tree transplanting machine, but more often nowadays it's just done on your hands and knees, where we have 5,000 seedlings to work with, and a crew goes out and just hand plants them in a line. Oftentimes nowadays in fabric, to help control weeds. And so that becomes then a seed production plot. And so again, remember the seed for these grasses right here, I think this is cordgrass, were probably collected a year earlier, propagated in the spring, planted out, I'm going to say maybe in early September in this case. That planting took, let's say, 2 years, more years, to mature and start to produce seed. So then we would collect that seed, sometimes enough to machine collect, combine, more often by hand. We would then have enough seed that we could take that seed and plant seed in the ground to get to take it up from, let's say this hand-planted field was maybe 1 acre, size of a football field, to from seed 2 years later, we were able to get enough seed to plant 5 acres. And then from that 2 years later, from that field, we had enough seed where we could plant 25 acres. So, but that whole process is 5 to 10 years to get from that initial collection on to the point where we have some volume. So it's a very long, tedious process. And with some species, you don't even go there. You just simply grow them in the greenhouse as live plants, and that's sort of as good as you're going to get. You're never going to get it up to the point where you're producing volumes of seed. So here again, these are now some mature stands that were planted. This on the left, I believe, is Bromus calmi, one of the native cool season grasses. And on the right, I think, is little blue stem, and one of the mainstays. Very kind of briefly, these are some of the air screen separators, they're called. So this is equipment that cleans the seed and processes seeds going up in the elevator on the left. And you can see scale of this, the guy standing on the floor there. These are pretty big machines. And by the way, they cost a fair amount of money. This is a smaller one. And these are the screens that the seed goes through. This whole seed processing technology is very fascinating and really works pretty well. It wasn't developed for wildflower plants or native grasses. It was developed for crops, wheat, oats. Um, These are the various kinds of screens, and you pick the combination of screens that fits the seed shape and size. Could be an oval, could be a slotted, like this one in the middle, or the one on the right. There's diamonds, there's rectangles, there's all kinds of sizes. This is a very primitive mixing where we can mix some of the ingredients to make meet a certain standard. Same on the right, on the old-fashioned way, on the concrete floor with shovels. And we end up with a finished product that can be available, for anybody's use. Now, up in our northern region, up in Duluth and beyond, we collect from a lot of rented property where we will rent some property that has a good stand of something on it, and we'll hand pick. This looks like an Astor collection. I'm not sure, but that is another option. It's a tedious process. Now, again, as I said earlier, a lot of plants that's kind of their end game. You collect enough seed to propagate plants, and you don't take it to the next level of mass producing those plants for seed. So things like, in this case, Jack in the Pulpit, this is a seed flat. That's the surface of the seed flat. And here's some others. The one on the back right is coming up a little bit. You can see a little green in it. This is a little bit later down that process where we have taken the propagated seedlings and transplanted them one by one into cell packs, so that when you come to our retail store to get plants for your project, this is what you end up buying. So this is a product that we produce in quantity and quite a lot of species. And I'm sure many of you have experimented with growing your own plants. It's doable at home, but it really, really helps to have a greenhouse and that direct, more intense light for prairie plants and wetland plants. So again, we have literally hundreds of thousands of seedlings. This is prairie smoke, one of the high demand plants. A lot of people like this for their home plantings. And so again, the mix of plants that you get if you come to our store is a result of decades of work. We don't have to go back into the wild to collect very much seed anymore. We get enough seed production right off of our flats to do the next year's generation of plants. We also have established a lot of small plots, we call them, in the surrounding fields for the purpose of seed production in small quantities for use in our greenhouses. This is mostly seed that is not available for sale. It could, at the end of it, it could be 1 cup. Small seed, it could be 10,000 seeds, from which we would hope to get 1,000 seedlings. And we probably would get 200, like, who knows? So again, our source material now comes pretty much from plots that we have established. And that's partly because the original remnants, as I said earlier, are disappearing or actually gone. There's so many sites that I used to get seed at that are simply not there anymore. And so it's bothersome and challenging. Fortunately for PRI, we have this relatively substantial property where we have nucleus populations of many of these things. A good number of those have been established by us. Some of them are remnant. Our property up near Fargo, up near Moorhead, has quite a nice amount, like 100 acres, of true unplowed prairie, remnant prairie. And so that we have source material up there that's pretty reliable. So again, you can look to other sources. Prairie Moon, most of you know Prairie Moon. Most of you probably have heard of Shooting Star. And there's more. Taylor Creek Nursery down in southern Wisconsin, and there are many others. Some of you producers are probably listening in on this right now. And the scope of it is, if you're going to really be in it, gets to be pretty big. This all takes a lot of money, a lot of capital, and a lot of staff to make it work. We have company-wide, we probably have, well, I'm sure in the peak of the season, we have maybe 15 full-time greenhouse employees. And year-round, we probably have 4 or 5. So takes a lot to keep everything going. Again, plant production, this is up at our site in Duluth, or near Duluth, where we produce northern boreal type species. These are, by and large, not prairie plants. These are wetland plants and northern forest plants. This is that same site. Much smaller scale, nonetheless, important species. And here we are back in Princeton at our site here. I'm not sure, it's just a bunch of plants getting ready to go on an order. These are sod flats. Some of you may have purchased these. So this is a really good solution for small spaces. So let's just say you had a space that was 100 square feet, 10 by 10, and you didn't want to wait 2 years. You could buy sod flats that we've been growing for 2 years, maybe more, and they're all ready to go. And you can just lift the growing material right out of the plastic and put it on the ground, put another one right next to it, another one next to that, and step back and go, look at my beautiful prairie. It's all good to go. And so we actually produce a fair number of these of different. We have woodland flats, which are very popular. We have wet prairie, dry prairie, wetland plants, sod flats. So again, just a different concept. And it's something that you could, if you have the right growing space, again, you could do. Trees and shrubs, we produce a lot of trees and shrubs. So I know that we're going to get to some questions, and I have a lot to talk about before that. So I need to move on here and talk a little bit about the restoration process. In some cases, many cases, that essentially means gardens. So again, just to kind of clarify the definitions. In our business, I consider anything less, well, quite frankly, I consider anything less than the size of a football field to be a garden. That might be a little long and strong for many of you, but a 10,000 square foot prairie, if you want to call it that, which is about 1/4 of an acre, I think we should agree upon as calling that a garden. Now, the difference between our definition of a garden and the traditional horticultural definition of a garden is that a horticultural garden is designed with certain plants in certain places, and it's typically designed that those plants will stay in that location. A native garden, as you probably all know, is meant to kind of set the table and let it do its own thing. And so you try and get the plants in the right place, and you certainly consider the aesthetic. You consider some design, and you consider, what's closest to your front window where you're going to see it a lot and all that. But really, if you're a member of the Wildwinds, you start with ecological considerations. So you're focusing on creating a palette of plant material that fits ecologically. Soils, light, moisture, those are really critical elements. So you create a palette of materials and you can turn to your local suppliers and find the availability of those plants. And you can find a generalist species, and I'll use prairie violet as an example. If you look at the dot maps for prairie violet, it grows virtually statewide, everywhere except the very tip of the arrowhead. You can find Viola pedata foeta. It fits ecologically in virtually the whole state. Another one like that is Gallium borale, the northern bedstraw, or Heliopsis helianthoides, the common sunflower. These are plants that are really widespread. So then you get to the next criteria where you say, am I tolerant of 6-foot high big blue stem? Or is that too big for my planting? Maybe subjectively, I don't want it in my garden. And so you look at that criteria, height. You can look at blooming dates. You can look at color. You can do all that stuff. It's great fun to research all these sources and you get to know the plants that way, of course. And so at the end of the day, we start with ecological factors. And then in some cases, we do, like the one you're looking at on the screen right now, we do shorten it down because this is a roundabout, actually, and visibility safety is an issue. And so in a case like this, it's a practical consideration that has to be made. And you end up with then a palette of plant materials. This particular garden is up in Pelican Rapids, Minnesota. And it has a lot of prairie smoke, a lot of prairie drop seed, prairie phlox. As you see, everything is pretty short. And it's really a gorgeous, in my subjective view, a very beautiful garden. But it is, by our definition, a garden. Now, outside of this roundabout, there's about 20 acres of what I would call a prairie. And that prairie has tall grasses. It has a much wider palette of material because it doesn't have some of the practical needs associated with visibility and aesthetic values. So this gets a lot of visitor appreciation. People come in here and we're trying to have a little bit of a wow factor. So most of you that have a home prairie, a wild garden of any kind, that's an important factor. You want to have native plants. You also want to have things that you consider beautiful. I don't think I'm out of line to say that. You also want to have a balance of native materials that is moderately low maintenance. And by putting the right balance of things in your planting, you can achieve that. So that's an important consideration also, maintenance. What's it going to take to keep it healthy and happy? So all those factors have to be looked at. This is the same garden as the previous slide, is this slide. This is 6 weeks later. And so now we're past the phlox. Liatris, that's not Canada thistle, that's liatris, or purple prairie clover maybe. This is prairie drop seed. I realize you can't see what I'm pointing at. But the light limey green is prairie drop seed, Sporobolus heterolepis. Wonderful landscape plant, native prairie plant, late successional. Not one that you should count on from seed. You can seed a lot of it on bare ground, and you will get almost none of it for, I'm going to say 5 years, but 10 years is probably more realistic. It's so late successional, it just doesn't germinate initially, but it will eventually. It's just that prairies and native plants live on a different timeline than you and I do. And so 100 years is not a long time for most native communities, whereas most of us will be dead by the time we're 100. We tend not to think in this at the same time scale. Prairie dropseed, I believe, lives to be hundreds of years old. And I don't have any objective evidence of that, but I have over 50 years of observation, and I'm probably pretty darn close to right. So many of these plants, now this is a larger landscape. This is up in St. Cloud, and it's a blend of some traditional landscape and a lot of native plants. I would call this a prairie, but it's a prairie that we had the good fortune of having very dry, sandy, gravelly soil, which then provides the option of shorter grasses. And so drier generally equates with shorter. Richer, wetter soils equates in Minnesota to taller. So in a gravelly, sandy, dry prairie, it's a lot easier to establish and maintain a prairie that's spaced with cytosgrama, little blue stem, some blue grama grass, which is native in St. Cloud, and a whole array of forbs, as you can see. And again, the forbs on this project, as with all of our projects, are selected to suit the conditions, to match the conditions. So these are plants that grow typically in gravel and sand. And the great thing about native plants is that there's hundreds of species to pick from. So you can almost always create a diverse palette. Now, I would like to condition that comment a little bit by saying this prairie, which is about 20 acres in total size, not the part you see, but it goes all around. Before settlement, would probably have had 250 species of vascular plants. This planting, which is a pretty upscale and good planting, I'm going to say if we went out there and crawled around long enough, we could maybe come up with 40, 45, maybe 50. So we're at 20% of what the real prairie was. Now, it looks great. And unless you're a botanist or scientist or really an avid plant person, you probably wouldn't know the difference. I mean, 99% of the patients that come into center care would look at this and go, wow, that's really cool. It's diverse. It's beautiful. And they wouldn't go, oh, that's only 20% of a real prairie. But in fact, it actually is about 20%. So I say that partly because we all have a long ways to go to get better. So there's 80% of the native species in a prairie that we're not working with, and very, very few people are. If somebody came to us and had an unlimited amount of money and a nice space with some diversity, heavier soils and sandier soils and ups and downs, we could maybe do 100 species, maybe. So even there, we're only at 40% of what was really originally there. So, you know, we got a long ways to go. Hopefully 100 years from now, there'll be somebody sitting here who will tell you her story about how in her time they can plant 150 species. That would be fabulous. But maybe this is an appropriate time to comment on that diversity. It's so interconnected, as everything is, that because we only have, say, 20% of the species present, we could be missing, not feeding some really important insects. And so the insects don't have what they need. And in fact, the insects may be, you know, being killed because of agricultural or other use. So there's simply that many fewer of them in the first place. And then to top it off, they don't even really have what they need. And then that species of plant, because there's a lack of pollinators, do not get pollinated. Hence, there's a great reduction in viable seed. Hence, the next generation of those plants is very weak, and in some cases, maybe gone. And so we have the perennial parent plants for as long as they live. In some cases, that might be more than 100 years. But if they're not recruiting a new generation, eventually those parent plants will die, and that species will be gone. So I think that's a real concern that scientists need to study. I'm sure somebody is, but that there's a real connection between pollinators and the regeneration of our plant species. And again, many species are generalists. They don't rely on any specific pollinator, but some are not that way. Some are very, very specific. And if that insect is gone, eventually there will not be viable seed produced, and eventually those plants will be gone, that species will be gone. So I've seen this really in my lifetime. It's alarming. I've seen things like prairie gentian, and I don't know, I wish I was in a room with you all, and I could ask you to raise your hands and show me how many of you have ever really seen a prairie gentian. It's a stunning plant. When I was young, I used to see hundreds. I've read accounts where down along the Cannon River Valley, the hillsides would be solid. You can go down there today and you won't find any. So what's going on with that? Even on good remnant prairies, I'm talking about really good preserved SNA type prairies, the population of prairie gentian is almost gone. So, you know, there's certain species that we should band together, we the wild ones, should band together and target, because reproducing those plants and putting those in your projects could actually be really meaningful and helpful. So just like at one time, you know, there was a huge effort to save bluebirds. We should be thinking about some of the plant species, trying to reproduce those species and get them into places where they have a viable opportunity to remain. So again, I could produce a short list of those species, but I'm not a scientist as such. And so again, this CentraCare project is a mix of a lot of different things. This is dotted blazing star. This is the short, dry gravel blazing star. Some of you may know this. When I first started to know prairies, I knew of a 160-acre prairie where there were thousands of these. And today, that's the gravel pit. There's none there. This is a good fit at CentraCare because of the gravel and the sand. According to John Weaver, kind of the father of prairie, this plant has an 18-foot root. It's about 18 inches high. It has a taproot that very deep. The strategy is to always maintain a moisture supply. Let me show you one other thing. If you look at behind the blazing star, that's a yellow sulfur or cloud butterfly. But the thing I wanted to point out is the grass seed heads on the right of the image. That's blue grama grass, Bouteloua gracilis. And blue grama is native out on the Great Plains. It's very, very common grass in Western rangeland. So Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado. And it comes into Minnesota about halfway across the state. The edge of its range is really at St. Cloud. So it's appropriate in this site. In fact, it probably was there 500 years ago. But we have it in this planting for lots of reasons, because it's short and it fits the site. But what I wanted to say is these different strategies, and you have to think about this in your own projects, different strategies for survival on these plants. So here you've got a blazing star with a taproot that goes down up to 18 feet. Right next to it, you've got grama grass, which has a completely different survival strategy. It's shallow rooted. It only really has roots that go down about 2.5, maybe 3 feet. What's the survival strategy? When it gets dry, it literally dries up, and it has a tolerance to be dormant for a long time, but it also is a very quick reseeding plant. So usually there's a viable seed population in the soil. So when it starts to rain again, it'll germinate and grow very quickly. I've seen this produce seed in 14 weeks. So from seed. Whereas that blazing star, to really get to a point where it blooms, is a minimum of 2 years and probably more like 3 to 4. So different survival strategies. Some go down deep to maintain a source of water. Other species dry up. Desk flower is another one that does that. It just kind of says, okay, I'll just go in a shell and hold out until the rain comes. That could be a year, that could be a month. So your wetland projects, and I'm sure a lot of you have rain gardens or in the proximity of a rain garden. Again, site matching is everything. So obviously here you're going to use wetland plants. This image is just an erosion control. This was a big project on, I'm going to say this is Lake of the Isles. Could have been Calhoun. Where, we use basically biolog on the shoreline, and the general contractor has gravel, and there's all kinds of ways to retain the shoreline. This is coconut fiber blanket, and the seed is underneath there, which would come up through. Of course, we hear so much about fires today. And those of you who know PRI know that we are advocates big time of fire. And I think you probably also all know that the Native Americans prior to settlement used fire a great deal. And for attracting game and for controlling vegetation and keeping vegetation down so they could see if there were any enemies out there or other things like that. So this notion of us as a society running away from fire, the Smokey the Bear thing, has been a real negative long-term 100-year plus impact that I think there's a silver bullet here with these big fires out west. Because if you listen to the media, you will hear on a regular basis, I'll bet you could turn the radio on tomorrow and you could hear this, that one of the reasons these fires are so catastrophic is because there's a lot of fuel out there, because controlled burns have not been implemented to reduce the fuel load. So I think because of these catastrophic fires, we're coming out of a time where society really views fire as the bad guy. We have to learn to use it as a really beneficial and economical tool. If controlled burning can be done in some of these areas where fuels are building up, we could save billions of dollars in lost homes, and hardships galore, and including improving the health of the landscape. So I think we're going to see that now going forward, that this year, and it's not over, is really reinforcing the issue that somehow our society needs to not just condone, but encourage the intentional use of fire to manage the landscape more than we ever have in the past 40 years. We've been burning for the whole history of PRI. We do almost 400 burns a year. Now, a lot of those are tiny. Some of them are pretty big, hundreds of acres. But it's just the tip of the iceberg of what really should be done. And so again, your home landscapes, obviously you have to be very careful. Really, you should employ professionals. But maybe in another 5 or 10 years, there will be ways that you can do your own burns. We don't, believe me, we don't like to charge you money for those burns. We don't make money on our fires. And it would be great if everybody could kind of do their own. But of course you can't, because too many things would happen, bad fires, and people would get hurt and so on. So you can't do that, but maybe there's some in-between future where some of you could, if you have a project that's completely surrounded by streets, sidewalks, mowed grass, boy, it's kind of a no-brainer. We're almost embarrassed to charge you to show up with 4 people and spend 20 minutes burning that. But that's how it works right now. So again, fire can be big, it can be scary, and it can be really major, like out on the West Coast right now. Believe me, unless some of you have been there, you would be absolutely astounded. So I'm almost finished, and then we can go to some questions. Some of you know these books. They were put out by the DNR some years back. They're fairly complicated. They contain a wealth of really good information. They were put together by the County Biological Survey, which is a group of DNR employees who are, really good botanists, really good ecologists. I would venture, without a doubt, at least some of the best in North America, much less Minnesota. So these are very knowledgeable folks who went out for years and measured the plant communities that are out there. And not just remnant plant communities, but also some disturbed plant communities. And so if you ever have a chance to really dig into these books, they're divided into 3 different major sort of biomes of the state. And so the one that's most germane to the Twin Cities metro area is the Eastern Broadleaf Forest in the middle here. And so the one on the far left is the Northern Coniferous Forest, basically. And the one on the far right is the prairies and prairie parkland up in the northwest part of the state. So again, when you really dissect these books, there's a tremendous amount of information. They're relatively complicated, but spend some time on it if you get a chance. My guess is that you can find almost all of it, if not all of it, online. So you could start with that, and maybe, yeah. And so, you don't even have to try and find a hard copy. I believe they went out of print last year, and I think it's gotten pretty challenging to find the actual books now. So anyway, all that in mind, if you find a used set, you should buy them. They're collectible. So anyhow, let's just see. And this is just my question slide. So this is the last slide, when we'll just leave this sit on the screen a little bit and maybe go back to our question and answer time. So I'm not sure how that works mechanically here.
So hi, I'm Jessica Miller and I'll be moderating the questions for you, Ron. And I've been collecting them as you've been speaking. First of all, just want to thank you so much for sharing 50 years of experience with us. I think we're all kind of energized, and we'll have some longer questions, but wanted to start just with picking penstemon seeds. Penstemon grandiflora specifically, would it be better to wait for them to fully dry, or would it be okay to pluck some of them now when they're still green?
Okay, bear in mind that the two main penstemons in Minnesota, Penstemon grandiflorus and Penstemon gracilis, are both sand plants. So in their natural habitat, they grow in the Anoka sand plain, or perhaps in the sands down around Inver Grove, Hastings, and elsewhere where it's really sandy. Now, one could surmise that that's partly because they get abraded, they get scratched. And so scarifying that, especially grandiflorus, which is much bigger, is a reasonably good idea. So if you have a small amount of Penstemon grandiflorus seed, I'd suggest that you do a little experiment, and that you take some very fine sandpaper, lightly rub, let's just say half the seed that you have, between that sandpaper. Not a lot. It doesn't take more than one little scratch on the seed coat. And don't do the other half of your seed, and compare how they grow. And I'm quite sure that you'll see the scarified seed will be quite a bit better. So, again, a lot of this seed, like grandiflorus, can lay on the surface of the soil for years and not germinate. And that's because it hasn't gotten scarified. The seed coat is really challenging and it doesn't allow moisture to get into it. And so until a windstorm comes along, or that seed gets stepped on by a deer or whatever, and it gets scratched a little bit, a lot of times it doesn't grow. We don't know that. We go out into a Burnham Prairie and we see a Penstemon grandiflorus, and for all we know, that plant was laid there as a seed for 25 years and then finally germinated, and we see that life stage, which might only last for 3 years, might only last for 2 years. And its whole purpose, besides producing that lovely flower for all of us, and for the bumblebees that love it, and everything else, is to produce seed for the next generation. And so again, we benefit from one stage of that. Now, Penstemon gracilis, and I'll be very brief, Penstemon gracilis is a whole other story. It's very tiny seed, and but also grows in sand. And it has a different circumstance, and I'm not 100% confident that I can give you a direct answer, but I think it has a lot to do with freezing and thawing. And so it does get some moisture in that tiny seed, which cracks the seed open and germinates. Next.
So I love your use of palettes of plants, the idea that I'm an artist in my garden, I thought was just lovely. And also connecting not just the pollinators co-evolution with those plants, but thinking about those soil types and how that helps plants procreate. I thought that was really interesting. We've got a question about genetic drift with your reproduction line. Do you end up feeling like it's monocultures and that you're seeing some of that less genetic drift?
Well, that's a big topic, and I'm not an expert. But while I'm thinking of it, I want to mention that most of you, maybe all of you, know that you can go online and to a number of really good sources to show images, photographs, but you can also look at dot maps and interpret where plants grew originally. Now, as time has gone on, those dot maps are maybe getting diluted a little bit more and more, unfortunately. with plantings that have been done, and people don't really realize that these plants weren't originally native to these sites. It's sort of assumed. Purple coneflower is a good example. I mean, Echinacea purpurea was not native to Minnesota. And so many people use it, and I'm sure many of you do. It's a beautiful plant, but it only grew over to the Milwaukee and kind of lower eastern Wisconsin area. It did not come across to Minnesota.
Oh my goodness.
The Echinacea that we have here in Minnesota is Echinacea angustifolia, and it's a western plant, and it grows back to the east about a little bit past Alexandria, and then down to the southwest and around the very bottom of Minnesota into northern Iowa. But again, the Twin Cities, as an example, is in a no man's land when it comes to purple coneflower. There weren't any native purple coneflower species in the middle part of Minnesota. Now, that doesn't mean that 500 years ago, maybe there was, or 1,000 years ago. But at the time of settlement, there was not. Now, that said, going back to the genetic question, I think a huge part of that story, and you've all probably read or heard about it, is this whole issue of corridors and genetic migration and the whole health of species based on integration of gene pools, and the fact that we've decimated that opportunity for species that are not very mobile. So whether you're talking about seed mobility, i.e. windborne, okay, great, it can go 500 miles. But what about a seed like penstemon that, each year maybe has an opportunity to spread 5 feet? And then after, let's say 10 years, it's gone 50 feet and it hits the edge of your restoration and it hits 100 acres of blacktop and mowed lawns. It's dead in the water. It can't go any further. So this is a really, really noble part of the wild ones, in my view, is that there's enough planting going on now. Some of these connections are possible. So you and your neighbor and their neighbor and the city park and et cetera, the highway, can provide corridors for some genetic movement. And so, and this is certainly true of not just of plants, but think about a spider or a turtle or, everything.
Yes.
So this is a really important issue. It's being addressed. The prairie corridor concept is a very wonderful thing, and I think it's certainly helping the issue. But again, we as a company, PRI, have decided years ago that we would not play God when it comes to global warming. Climate change is not something that we're calculating into our basically equation. And that is partly because there's so many other variables. It's not just temperature. It's soils, it's pollinators, it's a whole host of things. If you take Rhodiphyta pinnata, yellow coneflower, and you take it up to the northwestern part of the state, it'll last about maybe 10 years and it'll be gone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because there's so many other variables that are not right. You can get it to germinate and you can get it to show up, but eventually it's not, what happens is it's not regenerating.
Oh,
So yeah.
I think your
Go ahead.
encouragement, I really think your encouragement of, us doing it together, you've done a lot of work so that we have plant stock available to help transform our pallets, the land that we're managing. And I think that seed set is just so exciting. I know I have some plants that have the insects to make the seed set get me excited. I've got a couple of easy questions. How many sites do you manage that you operate?
Oh boy, I'm going to say 2,000 as just a quick number.
Sounds great. And then Somebody asked about grass ID tips, that it's so hard to tell what they are before they flower or before they, for the grass. Do you have any
The
other
grasses?
identification? Yep.
Oh. Yeah, it takes a lot of experience to recognize a 1-inch grass seedling. It can be done. There is a publication. Do you know what it is, Miles? Gosh, I wish I had that. We have a little booklet, and we didn't make it, that shows photographs of seedling grasses. It's really quite good. I think it comes out of the University of Iowa Press or from Iowa. I think we have one, and I've got a helper here. He'll run and check and see if he can grab it, and I can come back to you with that answer.
Fantastic. And that one actually may lead us also into, we're kind of excited about your knowledge. And so when you talked about the 5 species or a number of species that you would particularly like to see or feel that they need preserving, can you give us 5 perhaps, and other top priorities, set us on the path?
Yes, I'm sure with some thought I can do more than that, but because there are a lot of plants that are really in trouble. I would certainly put downy gentian, prairie gentian, Gentiana purpurulenta on that list. Maybe I would put Gentiana flavida. That's kind of the creamy, whitish gentian.
Okay.
This, by the way, is a much more amenable plant to gardens and so on. It's very beautiful. I don't know, of all the folks here who are listening, if any of you have that in your garden or your planting, but I'd be interested in hearing about that. I'm concerned about, not only in relation to how many billions there were, and comparatively how few there are today, of prairie violet, a really common native prairie plant it's down to here and there, and it's not too hard to work with. It can go in virtually every garden or every planting. The problem has been sort. The problem is, we, until the last 5 years, we haven't produced it in enough quantity. We're starting to really ratchet up because we're concerned. So you can buy it. It goes great in almost all plantings.
And now, to clarify too, prairie violet is different from the common violet we have. Is that correct?
Well, common violet I don't know what that, you'd have to give me a species on that, because there are a lot of violets. So,
Yeah.
there are woodland violets, and there are wetland violets, and some other sunny open violets. But maybe your question is, Viola pedata is bird's foot violet. Bird's foot violet has the yellow center, and it's a gorgeous plant. It's a big flower. It can be up to almost an inch in diameter across. Prairie violet does not have the yellow center and is much more common. Bird's foot in Minnesota only comes into the eastern portion of the state. So you find it up a little bit around Hinckley and the sands up there. You find it over by the St. Croix Valley. But once you get as far east, as far west as, let's say, I-35, or maybe a little west of that, you won't find it any further west. So it's not truly a plant of wide open western prairies, whereas prairie violet, Viola pedata fida, is.
Fantastic.
So again, Viola pedata fida, once extremely abundant, now not very. I can give you some more. Let's see. I'm concerned about prairie phlox, believe it or not. Again, once very common, and now still common, but not that common, and a plant that grows throughout the state and could be in almost every planting. It grows in relatively dry to very wet, and It's beautiful by most standards. So that's another good one. I'm trying to think here. I'll send you a list.
Fantastic.
I'll try and send you a list.
That's very thoughtful. And then burning versus haying. Do you have a for small patches like a half an acre or less?
Well, there's a big difference. And a lot of you might think, well, there really isn't much different. What is the difference? The difference is that number one, with fire, you're removing the biomass, so you're reducing the litter layer, the organic layer at the surface. And that's really important for germination of new recruitment, new generations of these plants. A lot of them, most seed does not like to germinate in a high organic layer. It wants to be in contact with mineral soil. And so when organic layers build up on the surface of the soil over decades, it really reduces the kind of plants that you might find growing there. And so I think it's a huge difference if people really would study that, and I haven't, but if people really would, you would find very big differences. Now, with fire, a lot of people think you're recharging the soil with nutrients, but you are actually depleting the nutrients. Some of the nutrients go up in smoke, no pun intended. They literally go up into the atmosphere. So yes, there's a recharge of ash and nutrients into the soil, but there's also a loss into the atmosphere. So on balance, there's a net loss. It's not a net gain. And the net gain, or the gain that does go into the soil, is relatively short term. So it's available nutrients, but for a short time period. So, there's a whole nother topic, which I think we're just starting to see the tip of after roughly 150 years of having broken the prairie. Let's assume that most of Minnesota prairie was broken in 1870-ish. And that's only 150 years ago, or just almost a millisecond in the big picture. Now you think about all of the stored organic matter in the soil and all of the stored nutrients in that organic matter and roots and dead organic matter that we have released into the system because we've, eradicated that layer of organic and a lot of those nutrients. So it's almost like thinking about free radical cancer cells. We have all of this free radical nutrients in our atmosphere and our water. It's a huge change, and it could be part of the fact that we're just starting to see 150 years later. Remember, that's a couple of seconds in geologic time. We're starting to see the impacts of that. So, that could be why we're seeing a loss, what scientists are calling species homogenization, where even on good remnants, we're losing species. It could be pollinator issues. It could be nutrient issues. It could be genetic issues. There's a lot of things that it could be, but nonetheless, it is happening. We can go out to remnant prairies that are 1,000 acres in size, too big to seemingly matter, and yet scientists are measuring the diversity on those large prairies, and it's going down rapidly. The grasses are taking over, and interestingly, a lot of the species that are self-pollinated are gaining in strength, and the species that are insect pollinated are losing. And so, again, I don't have the objective data on this. Maybe you can find things online, but that's what, at least on the surface, it's looking like it's happening. And it could even be the injection of additional nutrients favors certain species and not others. So, when we plant a prairie or when you guys plant wild plantings, I can tell you that one of your most challenging conditions will be high nutrient levels and rich soil. If you've got lean soil, low nutrient levels, you're going to be way ahead. I don't care if you're talking about a woodland or a prairie or a wetland.
Oh, it's so helpful to hear these, to hear you speak about these things so we can connect to them better as we experiment and use our palette on our landscapes. I've got another question about the jumping worms. Do you think they will have an effect maybe good for native seeds?
What would be good for native seeds?
The jumping worms and latest invasive.
Oh, I don't have the answer. I don't know enough about it.
Okay.
So I would decline, but my general answer, my speculative answer would be no, not good.
And then with your seed collections and extension.
Although I have to tell you, that sounds like a great name for some kind of new candy in a box.
Maybe it's good for advertising.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have an endangered or threatened plants that are on your list of plants for sale?
Do we sell them? No.
Is that due to restrictions because of endangered?
Yes. I mean, in theory, we try not to bend those rules. Now, by the same token, there are some plants that are important to try and save, as we've talked about. And those should come under the direction probably of the DNR.
Mm.
So it could be that we would be commissioned to grow some of those, but they wouldn't be for sale.
Okay. And to kind of rope back around to the penstemon question, do those seed heads need to dry out fully before I brought them or before I harvested them, or is green okay?
Well, the way that seed industry works is the interior portion, the meat, if you will, the nut in the shell, the seed, okay, goes through various stages of ripening. And so it goes from something called the soft dough stage, which tries to identify what you can picture as sort of a mushy dough. It goes before that, it's actually the milky stage, where it's way too early. The soft dough stage is, you're probably going to get a very minimal percent. Then it goes into a stage that is more of a firm dough. If you pick seed at that point, you're going to get pretty good germination, even though it may appear to be kind of green. But the best thing is to let it harden up further. And so one way to do this on a seed that is reasonable size, what does that mean in native plant talk? Well, the diameter of a number 2 lead pencil, where you can bite it between your teeth and you can actually kind of hear it or feel it crunch a little bit. So a lot of seeds have a seed coat. And if you take that off, or if you can kind of peel that off, and then the interior portion is the actual seed, and you bite that, and it's got a notable crust on it, it's good to go. So it's highly variable. You can take black-eyed Susan seed, and it'll still be in the tail end of blooming. You can collect those seed heads, and it'll grow. It's amazing. You'd think there's no way. But you can definitely collect seed too early. So again, right now we're just starting to do some of our bigger grass seed collections. We are collecting big blue stems this week. But again, you can go out into a field and you can have a lot of variability. So some of it's too early, some might be gone. And you have to go for the kind of optimum. But again, try that test of kind of biting seed. And if you can feel that there's a grain of something there, it's not just much, or hollow. Sometimes native seed in particular, there won't be any seed. Cocoon is a really good example of that. Cocoon will produce what looks like a reasonable amount of seed. 90% of it will be empty. There won't be anything in those. They're little white BBs, more or less. And most of them are empty. And I'm sure it's a pollinator issue. And I don't know all the facts of it, but I would bet you anything that it's a pollinator issue.
Sure. And I think our last question for the evening is, can you talk more about why you can't sell endangered plants, like how that is beneficial? Because I know, we would love to have those plants in our yards and be helpful towards it.
Yes. Here's the main logic, and I won't weigh in on whether it makes sense or not. The logic is that they're trying to protect, they in this case would be our public servants, primarily DNR, are trying to protect remnant populations from being influenced by non-local origin gene pools. So in other words, they don't want you folks to buy a downy gentian from Northern Illinois and plant it in the relative proximity of a remnant downy gentian, because they feel that could actually diminish the viability of the remnant gene pool. So again, I won't weigh in on whether that makes sense or doesn't make sense. That is the general theory, is what is left they want to protect.
Okay.
And I think with the idea that someday the public sector, will control the reintroduction of those species, or they will control where they go and what the origin, the genetic origin of that material is. And they just don't want to risk having contaminated gene pools.
Sure.
That's my guess.
Yeah, like many issues, there's so much complexity to it, but I think that's a helpful way to think about it.
There's a lot of different opinions.
Indeed.
Okay. What do you think?
I think you have been a delight to have. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Now, I have a question back for you guys, though, and that is, on these virtual meetings, I mean, who really brings the snacks? Don't you guys usually have cookies, at the end of the meeting?
We have amazing volunteers and our Wildwood Twin Cities chapters who have been bringing snacks to all our meetings, and I'm sorry to say that you're on your own for the virtual meetings.
We'll find a way.
We will. I think we have to do virtual happy hours too.
Yeah, there you go.
All right,
well, it's been my pleasure.
I want to take a moment to thank you, Ron, and Jessica too, for this fantastic program. And we really appreciate you rolling with us with the new technology. We're all still figuring it out.
Well, I want you all to appreciate Miles Hagan. He helped me a lot. I basically just tell stuff that I already know. I don't have to do a lot of homework. Miles is very helpful behind the scenes.
Well, it's a combination. We are very eager for what you know, and we are very eager for what Miles. Hey,
There's Miles.
Hi.
For Miles helping you present it, because our chapter in particular, and I know our viewership beyond our chapter is very grateful for this presentation. And I personally, and through my chapter, Loveland Twin Cities, want to thank you for this great evening.
Well, you're very welcome. We'll hope to see you all somewhere along the way.